Okay, continuing on here. This is part 4, dealing with anti-citizen.
Written by other people who merely claim to be recording Jesus' words after the fact. Even in the book of Luke, we find an implicit admission that he didn't actually see any of this stuff for himself, but rather that he's simply compiling secondhand accounts from various anonymous eyewitnesses.
He was in contact with eyewitnesses. Okay, so again, this is what I find with so many atheists. They take the New Testament and they apply this incredibly super skeptical view of the New Testament, which if applied to any other document of antiquity, we'd have to throw it out. All of ancient history would have to go, because those other documents also have miraculous elements in them as well, and mythological elements, you know, if you want to term it that way. So we got to throw it all out. It's just gone, and nothing is historical. Is that what you're saying here? Or you're kind of trashing it. I don't think you really think it's the core is historical at all. So anyway, let's keep moving on here. But Luke was in touch with eyewitnesses. Read the we sections of Acts. Okay, so it's not simply he's getting it from secondhand information. He's writing down what eyewitnesses had told him. Okay, and he's also in contact with Paul. He had visited the Holy Land, where probably hundreds, if not thousands, of people that had heard Jesus were there. Many people think that's where he might have got the Q document when he visited the Holy Land. But anyway, let's keep moving on here.
And the Apostle Paul admits in his own epistle that no one actually told him anything about the Christ message, but that he instead received his entire message by pure revelation alone.
No, anti-citizen. Again, Paul in Galatians, which you have there, right? That's the book of Galatians. That was just before. Paul there is talking about his gospel that he received by revelation, that the Gentiles didn't need to be circumcised or obey the law of Moses in order to be justified. That's the gospel he's talking about. That's what he's talking about. He had revelation from. Paul was persecuting Christians, anti-citizen. He didn't know what they were saying. He knew they were teaching that Jesus was the Messiah, that he had been crucified, that he was the Son of God. He knew those things, and he was persecuting them. He just didn't know, and then he received all this information by revelation, and he just is persecuting these people for no reason at all. Come on, man. This is what I'm telling you in our dialogue. Think through your sources. Don't just parrot stuff that you've heard from other places. I'm not sure where you got that little tidbit about Paul. Paul was in touch with Peter, Jesus' #1 disciples. Keep reading on in Galatians. That's what he's talking about. Acts bears witness to that as well. Paul was in touch with James, Jesus' brother. They were talking for 14 days. Paul had also visited Jerusalem. Later on, he'll visit Jerusalem again during the Jerusalem Council. So they didn't talk about Jesus or anything like that. He quotes traditions that he received from 1 Corinthians 9, 1 Corinthians 11, and 1 Corinthians 15, and probably 1 Thessalonians 4. These traditions that he received, where do you think he got those from, anti-citizen? He knew, and then a lot of the ethical teachings he talks about in his letters are straight from Q. Like they're not exact verbatim from Q, but they're very similar to Q. Read Romans 12, and a lot of Paul's talking about love and sexual immorality. That is Q information all the way, that most scholars say was probably a document, or at least an oral form in the 40s, by the 40s, probably even the 30s. So Paul was in touch with these eyewitnesses. He visited the Jerusalem church. He knew what they were saying. The revelation he's talking about there is his revelation about the Gentiles, is being called to the Gentiles to preach the law-free gospel to the Gentiles for them to be justified, that they don't need to be circumcised or obey the law of Moses to be justified. That's what the revelation he's talking about. Muslims make the same mistake. Same thing. Okay, let's keep moving on here.
Events such as the Nativity occurred long before Christ ever met any of his disciples, and therefore cannot possibly be eyewitness accounts under any conditions. Even the very authors of the Gospels themselves are completely anonymous, because all we have to go on is religious tradition to tell us who these guys actually were. We don't even have any original copies of the Gospels, but simply scattered fragments of copies of copies.
Here we go again. Copies of copies of copies. So all ancient history is gone because all we have are copies of Homer. All we have are copies of everything. All of our history is copies of copies of copies. The New Testament is the best, most well-attested manuscript, group of manuscripts that we have from antiquity. So if you throw up the New Testament as if it's unreliable because we have copies of copies, then you got to throw everything out. But again, they won't do that. No, no. We want to keep the history of Alexander the Great. We want to keep the history of the Roman emperors. We want to keep all this other history, what Josephus said and all that. But all we have are copies of copies of copies. Okay, you need to understand lower criticism and how that works. And the New Testament is 95 to 99% accurate. Most scholars say that. Even Ehrman concedes that we can get tremendously close to what the original manuscript says, although he double talks sometimes in his book. But if you read what he says in his more honest moments, he'll say, yeah, and all the things that he said. I remember people saying, oh, Bart Ehrman, his book refutes the New Testament, saying just it's all the manuscripts are totally bunk. And then I read this book. I go, oh, I learned all this in Bible college. Of course, there's the variants, and then there were certain sections like Mark 16:9-20 was added by a later scribe. John 8, the Johannine Common, and 1 John 5:7 is not even in the debate. So anyway, your copies of copies. Here we go.
Centuries after the fact. We even have multiple competing versions of the Gospels with wild variations and all sorts of crucial details.
All right, here we go. Da Vinci Code. This is straight Da Vinci Code stuff. These other Gospels, I'm going to stop it here. We're going to deal with this because I want to expand on this. These other Gospels, do you know what? You need to study the early church history, Anti-Citizen, and really understand why the early church did not accept these Gospels and they accepted the four. Okay, we're going to deal with that in our next video.